And now Congressman Hakeem Jeffries of New York, Director of Africana Studies at Lehigh University, Dr. James Peterson, who is also an MSNBC contributor. Great to have you here. James, you've been following this trial very closely. Yeah. And what strikes me about this is the point at which this interaction starts is similar to dozens of interactions I've witnessed in a million locales, on subways, at gas stations, in 7-Elevens, and then, well, and then...
People have been screaming for people to turn down rap music and hip-hop since the 80s.
Yes, exactly.
Right? It's been going on. It doesn't always result in someone's loss of life, and I think we have to look at Michael Dunn here. And again, I'm glad you guys talked about the letters, because the letters reveal some real racialized thinking. How ironic is it that this guy thinks that the system is biased in favor of blacks?
The court system.
The court system is biased in favor of blacks, and in reality, there is no metric, not in sentencing, not in anywhere in the criminal justice system where blacks are not biased against, right?
As someone who has to go back to your district, Congressman, right? And you stand in for the state, right? You're the representative. And my sense, growing up in New York City and the Bronx in the 1980s particularly, you know, people in the neighborhoods I grew up in just have no trust in the system, like zero trust that they're going to get a fair shake. And then high-profile cases happen like the ones that we saw last year with Trayvon Martin and this high-profile case. What do you say to people that say, basically, I think the game is rigged, I think the entire court system is biased against me, and I think every stereotype society has of me is enshrined in law?
Well, it's tough because it's like a Yogi Berra moment. It's deja vu all over again. We just went through this. It was a very traumatic experience for people in the communities that I represent all over the country who have a deeply held suspicion that African-American young men in particular are treated differently by the criminal justice system. And there's empirical evidence that bears that out.
That's right, yeah.
Their own personal experiences and empirical evidence. Now, in this particular instance, one of the most troubling aspects of the case is that this really should be an open and shut matter. Right. There was no gun, there was no imminent threat of violence. The only reason we're in this situation where there's suspense as to what the jury may arrive at is because of the stand your ground law. And that is part of the problem that we confront from a public policy standpoint, that you've got a feeling of mismanagement institutionalized in law to perhaps legalize vigilantism. In some instances, that was the case with Zimmerman. Hopefully it won't be the case with Dunn.
But in some ways, I think that part of the issue here is the law, right? But part of the issue is much deeper than the law of necessarily stand your ground, because you can look at racial disparities, for instance, in death sentences based on the color of the victim, right? That's right. Which apply broadly, right? There's all sorts of ways in which the criminal justice system is just shot through at every single juncture.
Racial bias. And this is the thing. This is when you have these expansive sort of self-defense laws, they can't. That's why when in the previous segment you're like, well, how do you even? What's the threshold? We can't have a sort of sensible conversation about what the threshold is to defend oneself unless we have a serious conversation about how racial bias informs all those kinds of decisions. And we're just not having that conversation. We don't even want to talk about race in this courtroom.
And what the law is doing in this particular instance is allowing for subjective bias perhaps to be elevated to be a legitimate defense.
That's right.
That's the problem.
And that is what's so perverse. I mean, when people say, well, if someone says, well, I honestly feared for my life, well, it's possible you honestly had completely erroneous racialized stereotypes of that person, and the honesty of your racial baggage shouldn't be exculpatory, right? That's what seems so perverse.
It's not, but it is, and it has been. And the thing is, we're not going to be able to overcome the challenges in the criminal justice system unless we confront the sort of pervasiveness of racial bias in our society.
You know, part of what came out of the Trayvon Martin trial was that the president's sort of amazing moment when he came out on that Friday and he talked off script about his reaction to that verdict, and he talked about young men of color particularly, and he dropped a line in the State of the Union about initiatives of young men of color. There was an article in the Washington Post about him sort of quietly attending these groups. What do you want to see come out of that initiative?
Well, I think you know, it's important that the president has now decided to focus on this issue with precision, right? Because not everyone themselves in a difficult position is open and available to having a one-size-fit-all approach. And young men of color, disconnected, disenfranchised in many instances, subjected to the biases of the criminal justice system, do need a targeted effort in order to help elevate them and provide them with the ability to pursue the American dream in the same way that others have. And so what we'd like to see from the president is not just a targeted approach, but resources dedicated to trying to deal with the particularized problem that he himself so eloquently identified post-Trayvon Martin. And now we're glad that we're beginning to see administrative effort put behind those words.
It also seems like one of these places where it's like if the expectation is always you're a thug because the person on the other side of the glass hears your music,
right,
it's easy to start thinking like, well, then it doesn't actually matter what I do. Right? Yes. Because if no matter what I do on this side of the glass playing my music, I'm a thug to you out there,
that's right,
it becomes very easy to stop caring about what you actually do.
It does, and you're describing the mentality of too many young people in America right now, because the system time and time again just sort of presents them with a lack of options, and in a lack of options you can sort of make those kinds of conclusions and you can be right. So the Zimmerman trial sort of reinscribes those things, and hopefully we'll have a different outcome here, but there are too many of these big trials that we look at and we sort of lose sight of some of the everyday things that are going on where people are sort of making these connections between race and bias and injustice in our society.
Congressman Hakeem Jeffries and MSNBC contributor Dr. James Peterson. Thank you, gentlemen, both.
Thanks.